Hey guys, welcome back. Today, episode 3, Guitar History. The life and times of Townes Van Zandt. I often tell people one of my tricks in trying to improve as a guitar player, as a songwriter, is to glean as much off of people that I admire as I possibly can. So I try to dig into their lives. If you can just get a small kernel out of doing that, every little bit helps, right? So I don't want to sound melodramatic as far as like getting into character, but I liken it to if a guy's going to play Abraham Lincoln, an actor, he's going to play Abraham Lincoln in an upcoming film. He's going to read books on Abraham Lincoln. He's going to go to places historically that Abraham Lincoln stood. He's going to watch documentaries on Abraham Lincoln to kind of get into character. And I think as a musician, a guitar player, as someone that admires songwriters, it's not a bad idea to try to delve into as much as you can to see if there's some little morsel, some little thing you can pick up and turn into your own. Townes Van Zandt's flagship piece was the single Pancho and Lefty. Probably will go down as one of the greatest folk country guitar tunes ever written. And a lot of us are familiar with that song based on what Merle Haggard and Willie Nelson did with it. Now, I have to confess, when I heard Pancho and Lefty, I assumed, Willie Nelson wrote another song, or, Merle Haggard and Willie collaborated on this particular tune. And it wasn't until years later when I did a little bit of research, and I'm like, well, hang on a second, who's this Townes Van Zandt guy they keep talking about? And here I didn't even realize Townes was the guy that wrote it. So let's rewind a tad and talk about the genesis of Townes Van Zandt, another Texan, Fort Worth, Texas. We've been doing a lot of Texans lately. Must be something in the water down there. 1944, born into wealth. So it wasn't because of a struggling childhood as a youth. He was born into wealth. His great grandfather or great grandfather, you'll have to check me on that, but let's just say his great grandfather was Isaac Van Zandt, who historically was a leader of the Republic of Texas. So there's some political lineage in there, as well as some financial privilege or comfort, let's say. That doesn't mean that he had a perfect childhood. It just means that there certainly weren't financial struggles. He talks about Ed Sullivan's, on the Ed Sullivan show, that episode, Elvis's performance on the Ed Sullivan show was the inspiration for him to pick up a guitar. So Townes, along with about a gazillion other guys, it's kind of like how you hear people that have achieved music stardom, major label success. When they're interviewed, you often hear the Beatles performance on the Ed Sullivan show was the inspiration for so many people. So not surprising there. Lightning Hopkins was, he stated, was an influence, which was a little bit of a surprise to me. And Hank Williams was another one, which is more to be expected. Townes' problems, I think, at least from his mother's standpoint, in 1962, after a drinking bender he was diagnosed with major depressive disorder. I guess that's what they were calling it back then. But at any rate, he received 3 months of insulin shock therapy. And I confess to you, I don't know what that is. Apparently, they didn't know what it was either. The ones that administered it, because his mother was quoted as saying it was the biggest regret that she had in her life. So apparently they weren't satisfied with the results of that therapy. It sounds like one of those deals where the cure is worse than the disease. But who knows what kind of effect that ultimately had on his later struggles, how much that had to do with it. By 1965, though, Townes was hitting the coffee shops and the club circuit and had catapulted him to some representation by 1968 to 1973 is when his most prolific time period. He put 6 records out. Now, none of them, there was no major label backing, but Kevin Eggers was one producer, one record company owner, and a person that represented him for quite a while. And we'll get into those lawsuits in a couple minutes. But the flagship tunes, as we talked about, Pancho and Lefty, 1983, Merle and Willie took Pancho and Lefty to number 1. Don Williams and Emmylou Harris took If I Needed You to number 3 in 1981. Pancho and Lefty has been covered by too many people to list. So how much he benefited from the publishing rights to that isn't really well known. I don't know if how much the rights he retained, how much of the rights that he sold off. It seems to me, though, as we get into in a couple minutes, we'll get into what he was left with. It seems to me somewhere along the way, someone either ripped him off or he was so jacked up and gacked out on drugs that he gave it all away. But Be Here to Love Me is one of my favorites. It's a tune that Norah Jones does on her second record that's really worth listening to, guys. I think she does a better representation. She does a version that's a better representation to Townes' own recording of it. I don't know. She just leaves more of it intact. And it sounds like I'm slagging on Merle and Willie Nelson's version of Pancho and Lefty, and I'm not really, but it wasn't until I heard Townes actually do the song on his 1977 Old Quarter, live at the Old Quarter in Houston, Texas. That's the one to listen to. And when you listen to that, you're like, okay, now I hear the polish, the unnecessary polish that they put on the Willie and Merle Haggard version. And, that was a record company thing. Certainly the record company was in Willie Nelson's ear and Merle Haggard's ear, like, this has to be a hit. And who am I to argue that? Because they made it a hit, a number 1 hit. But there's you listen, let me know what you think in the comments. I just think that there's some polish on there that, for my money, the performance of Pancho and Lefty is the old guard performance. And I think Townes had a little bit of the Dylan conundrum, where he wasn't known as a vocalist so much. So that was out of his musicianship, and his songwriting. His weak link was considered his vocals. But I'll tell you that his vocals grow on you. And his vocals, after you listen to a lot of Townes Van Zandt, and after you hear a lot of covers of Townes Van Zandt music, you realize how much that vocal is perfectly appropriate for that music. But Norah Jones does a great version of that. And Don Williams, Emmylou Harris did If I Needed You, took that to number 3 in 1981. And what Townes got out of this remains to be a little bit of a mystery. There's stories of Townes being gacked out on drugs and offering his catalog to people if they give him $20. If you watch his documentary, Be Here to Love Me, it's a phenomenal film, and I highly recommend it to anybody that's a Townes Van Zandt fan. But it's an extremely dark documentary, but true to his life. And I think the guy had... There's one story where he made a habit of putting model airplane glue on something, a card, or an index card or something. He'd put model airplane glue under his nose before he went to sleep. Now, I'm not an addict, so I don't understand that completely, because I would think, well, if you're asleep, do you know you're high? So I don't get that, but it shows the level and the depth of his issues, And at one point, one night when he did it, he woke up and the model airplane glue had gone down onto his front teeth and his gums, and he had to have all his front teeth removed. And I guess he ended up with false teeth after that. So the stories of his drug use are in the documentary are just it's heartbreaking to see this guy was clearly struggling, and I often remind myself of that. As much as you admire these people, whether they're songwriters or great guitar players, and you have those aspirations, if I could just do that, I wish I could do that. Well, careful what you wish for. You get the whole package. You get it all. You get the model airplane glue, you get the great song, you get the I'm shooting rum and coke into my veins. This is all stuff Townes did. Monster heroin addict, drinking straight whiskey at 10 a.m. So there was definitely, obviously it's a little passe to say demons. He had demons, but I don't know how else to describe it. But what strikes me about his career after, and we'll fast forward here a little bit, when he died in 1997, his children, he had 3 kids, they ended up taking Kevin Eggers to suing him over the rights. And it was reported that during that trial, prior to his death, he was making $100,000 a year, was his income. Obviously, he wasn't getting that. And when I look at that number, I think to myself, well, that doesn't even seem like enough, because you have Merle Haggard and Willie Nelson taking one of his tunes to number 1 in 1983. You have Don Williams and Emmylou Harris taking a song to number 3 in 81. And I'm like, that doesn't, plus his own catalog. Norah Jones, obviously covering his tunes, and you're like, well, how can that be? But you don't know how those publishing deals went. Like, how much did Townes give up in order to have Merle Haggard and Willie Nelson record that tune? How much did he give up for Don Williams and Emmylou Harris to do If You Needed Me in 1981? So those are legitimate questions, and I don't know the answers to them. But, obviously, during his drinking and drug exploits, who knows how many deals he entered into, because, as I said earlier, in Be Here to Love Me, they talk about him offering his publishing rights to various songs for $20 so he can go cop heroin. So, that's addiction. But here we are left with these phenomenal songs. And in close, I'd like to personally recommend the 1977 Old Quarter in Houston live performance. 1994's Road Songs is another gem. Notably, on Road Songs, he does a version of Dead Flowers by the Stones. That's, knocked it out of the park quality. And incidentally, that tune ended up on the soundtrack to Big Lebowski. When they're rolling, I think at the end credits, and I think it's in there during the beginning as well, and maybe sporadically in the film a little bit. I have it, and I've watched it a ton over the years. I just don't remember how often, but I know it's definitely on the ending credits. That Dead Flowers version they play on the Big Lebowski at the end is the 1994 Road Songs version. So definitely one that you want to check out, guys. So Townes Van Zandt, The Life and Times. And it's a sad biography. How much of his trouble was the music a byproduct of that? Vice versa? A little bit of both? Who knows? But we're left with a phenomenal catalog of music and a guy that we can admire as a creative genius and a flat-out sensational country picker.